Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Better off, I'm gonna find my way tonight. Way tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Just talk to me. We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make this happy face. Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off, I'm gonna find my way tonight. Way tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make this happy face too.
Okay, here we are once again. Hello. I know, not an exciting opening, but we are on chapter 16 and 17 of The Temple and the Lodge. Only 4 chapters to go, 2 tonight, 2 on Tuesday. We're done with this book, and then Thursday we'll be starting into 1984. So, let's just jump straight on into it. Chapter 16, The Emergence of Masonic Leaders. Excuse me. One of the key questions about the American War for Independence is how and why Britain contrived to lose it. For the war was not so much won by the American colonists as lost by Britain. Britain alone, quite independently of the colonists' efforts, had the capacity to win or lose the conflict, and by not actively choosing to win it, she lost it more or less by default. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, Brits. But, okay. In most conflicts, the War of the Spanish Succession, for example, the 7 Years' War, the wars of the Napoleonic era, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, the 2 world wars of our own century, victory or defeat by one or another combatant can be explained in military terms. In most such conflicts, the historian can point to one or more specific factors, certain tactical or strategic decisions, certain campaigns, certain battles, certain logistic considerations, such as supply lines or volume of industrial production, or simply the process of attrition. Any of these factors, the historian can say, either individually or in combination, brought about the collapse of one of the combatants, or rendered it untenable for one of the combatants to continue fighting. In the American War for Independence, however, there was no such factor to which the historian can satisfactorily point. Even the 2 battles usually regarded as decisive, Saratoga and Yorktown, can be regarded as decisive only in terms of American morale, or perhaps, with the wisdom of hindsight, in terms of intangible watersheds. Neither of these engagements crippled or even seriously impaired Britain's capacity to continue fighting. Neither involved more than a fraction of the British troops deployed in North America. The war was to continue for 4 years after Saratoga, during which time the British defeat was redressed by a series of victories. And when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the bulk of the British forces in North America were still intact, still well placed to continue operations elsewhere, still strategically and numerically in a position of advantage. There was in the American War for Independence no conclusive victory comparable to Waterloo, no ineluctable turning point comparable to Gettysburg. It seems almost as if everyone simply got tired, became bored, lost interest, decided to pack up and go home. Okay. In American history textbooks, certain standard explanations are routinely presented as military explanations for the British defeat. Because, of course, any such military explanation amounts to a testimonial of American prowess at arms. Thus, for example, it is often suggested, if not quite explicitly stated, that the whole of the colonial North America was up in arms, confronting Britain with a hostile continent arrayed against her, a situation akin to that of Napoleon's or Hitler's invasion of Russia, with an entire people united to repel the aggressor. More often still, it is maintained that the British Army was out of its element in the wilderness of North America, was untrained and unadapted to the kind of irregular guerrilla fighting employed by the colonists and dictated by the terrain. And it is often generally maintained that the British commanders were incompetent, inept, lazy, corrupt, outthought, and outmaneuvered. It is worth looking at each of these assertions individually. Okay. Interesting to read about the Revolutionary War from the British side of things. In fact, the British Army was not confronted by a continent or a people passionately united against it. Of the 37 newspapers in the colonies in 1775, 23 were in favor of the rebellion, 7 were loyal to Britain, and 7 were neutral or uncommitted. If this can be taken to reflect the attitudes of the populace, fully 38% were not prepared to support independence. In reality, a substantial number of colonists remained actively attached to what they regarded as the mother country. They voluntarily spied, voluntarily furnished information, accommodation, and supplies to British troops. Many of them actually resorted to arms and campaigned alongside British regular units against their colonial neighbors. In the course of the war, there were no fewer than 14 regiments of loyalists affiliated with the British Army. Neither is it tenable to argue that the British Army was unsuited and untrained for the kind of warfare being waged in North America. In the first place, contrary to popular impressions, most campaigns of the conflict did not involve irregular fighting at all. Most of it involved set peace battles and sieges of precisely the kind being fought in Europe, precisely the kind to which the British Army and the Hessian mercenaries within it excelled. But even when irregular warfare was employed, British troops were to no disadvantage. As we have seen, Amherst, Wolfe, and their subordinates, a mere 20 years before, had employed precisely that kind of warfare in wresting North America from France. In fact, the British Army had pioneered the sort of fighting sometimes dictated by the forests and rivers in which the techniques and formations of the European battlefield were out of place. Hessian troops might indeed have been vulnerable to such tactics, but British units like the 60th Foot, Amherst's old rifle regiment, could outdo and often outdid the colonists at their own game, a game which, after all, most of the colonists' military leaders had learned from British commanders. There remains the charge of incompetence and ineptitude on the part of the British commanders. So far as one of those commanders is concerned, Sir John Burgoyne, the charge is probably valid. As for the three primary commanders, however, Sir William Howe, Sir Henry Clinton, and Lord Charles Cornwallis, it is not. In fact, Howe, Clinton, and Cornwallis were quite as competent as their American counterparts. All three of them won more victories against the colonists than they lost, and larger, more substantial victories. All three of them had previously demonstrated their skill and would have occasion to demonstrate it again. Howe, in particular, had played a prominent role in the war against the French 20 years before, had learned irregular tactics from his brother, who died at Ticonderoga, had served under Amherst at Louisbourg and Montreal, had led Wolfe's troops up the Heights of Abraham at Quebec, and between 1772 and 1774, he was responsible for the introduction of light infantry companies into line regiments. Clinton had been born in Newfoundland and grown up in Newfoundland and New York, had served in the New York militia before joining the Guards and seeing action on the continent, where his rise in the military hierarchy had been described as meteoric. Cornwallis also distinguished himself during the 7 Years' War. Subsequently, during the fighting in Mysore, he was to win a string of victories that gave Britain control of southern India, and in the process was to act as mentor to the young Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington. And during the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, Cornwallis proved himself not just a skilled strategist, but also a wise and humane man, who had constantly to curb the overzealous brutality of his subordinates. These were not, in short, inept or incompetent commanders. But if the British High Command during the American War for Independence was not incompetent or inept, it was, to a degree never satisfactorily explained by historians, strangely dilatory, desultory, apathetic, even torpid. Opportunities were blandly ignored which would have been seized or pounced upon by far less efficient men. Operations were conducted with an almost somnambulistic, lackadaisical air. The war quite simply, was not pursued with the kind of ruthlessness required for victory, the kind of ruthlessness displayed by the same commanders when pitted against adversaries other than the American colonists. In fact, Britain did not lose the war in North America for military reasons at all. The war was lost because of other entirely different factors. It was a deeply unpopular war, such as the war fought in Vietnam by the United States 2 centuries later was to be. It was unpopular with the British public, with most of the British government, and virtually all of the British personnel directly involved, soldiers, officers, and commanders. Clinton and Cornwallis both fought under duress and with extreme reluctance. Howe was even more adamant, repeatedly expressing his anger, his unhappiness, and his frustration about the command with which he had been saddled. His brother, Admiral Howe, felt the same way. The colonists, he declared, were the most oppressed and distressed people on earth. See that? We were all oppressed. I want my reparations. Amherst's position was more militant still. At the outbreak of hostilities, Amherst was 59, 15 years older than Washington, 12 years older than Howe, but still perfectly capable of conducting operations. Following his successes in the 7 Years' War, he had become governor of Virginia, and had further developed his skills in irregular warfare during the Indian Rebellion led by Chief Pontiac. When the American War for Independence began, he was commander-in-chief of the British Army, and had been chafing against the bureaucracy and tedium of his desk job. Had Amherst taken command in North America, and, together with his old subordinate Howe, campaigned with the vigor he had displayed against the French 20 years before, events would unquestionably have fallen out differently. But Amherst exhibited the same distaste as those who did grudgingly take the field, and his superior rank permitted him the luxury of refusal. The first offer came in 1776, and Amherst declined it. In January 1778, he was approached again. This time, he was not even asked. The King George III actually appointed him commander-in-chief in America and demanded that he take control of the war there. Threatening to resign his commission, Amherst refused the King's direct order. Attempts to persuade him by members of the government proved equally futile. For Amherst, for Howe, and for most of the other British commanders, as for the bulk of the British public at large, the American War for Independence was perceived as a kind of civil war. Excuse me. In effect, they found themselves, to their own discomfiture, pitted against adversaries whom they could only regard as fellow Englishmen, often linked to them not just by language, heritage, customs, and attitudes, but also, in many cases, by actual family ties. But there was even more to it than that. As we have seen, Freemasonry in 18th century Britain was a network pervading the whole of society, and particularly the educated classes. The professional people, the civil servants and administrators, the educators, the men who shaped and determined public opinion. It also engendered a general psychological and cultural climate, an atmosphere which suffused the mentality of the age. This was especially true in the military, where the field lodges constituted a cohesive structure binding men to their units, to their commanders, and to one another. And it was even more true among ordinary soldiers, who lacked the ties of caste and family which obtained in the officer class. During the American War for Independence, most of the military personnel involved, commanders and men on both sides, were either practicing Freemasons themselves or were steeped in the attitudes and values of Freemasonry. The sheer prevalence of field lodges ensured that even non-Freemasons were constantly exposed to the institution's ideals. It could not fail to be apparent that many of these ideals were embodied by what the colonists were fighting for. The principles on behalf of which the colonists declared and then fought for independence were, incidentally perhaps, but still pervasively, Freemasonic. And thus, for the British High Command, as well as for the rank and file, they were engaged in a war not just with fellow Englishmen, but also with Freemasonic brethren. In such circumstances, it was often difficult to be ruthless. This is not to suggest, of course, that British commanders were guilty of treason. They were, after all, professional soldiers, and were prepared, however reluctantly, to do their duty. But they were at pains to define their duty as narrowly as possible, and to do nothing more. The influence of field lodges. There were unfortunately no rolls, membership lists, or other forms of documentation to establish definitively who among the British High Command were practicing Freemasons. As a rule, most military men were initially inducted into field lodges, and field lodges were notoriously lax both in keeping records and in returning such records as were kept to their parent lodge. Having once been chartered or warranted, a field lodge would usually tend to lose contact with its sponsoring body. This was particularly true of lodges warranted by Irish Grand Lodge, which had enough trouble with its own records, and it was Irish Grand Lodge, as we have seen, that warranted most of the early field lodges. In some cases, too, field lodges would warrant other field lodges, and the original parent lodge would never be informed. And as regiments were disbanded or amalgamated, field lodges would migrate, mutate, transplant themselves, sometimes obtain new warrants from different sponsoring bodies. Even outside the military, documentation was often appallingly patchy. All three brothers of George III, for example, are known to have been Freemasons. One of them, the Duke of Cumberland, eventually became Grand Master of the English Grand Lodge. Record exists, however, only for the induction of Henry, Duke of Gloucester, in February 1766. There is no indication of when, where, or by whom the Duke of York, at that time was already a Freemason, was initiated. Although one historian says limply that he was initiated abroad. If data are so haphazard and erratic in the case of a royal prince, they are all the more so in the case of military commanders. Not surprisingly, therefore, it cannot be ascertained whether Howe, Cornwallis, and Clinton were indeed practicing Freemasons. There are certainly abundant grounds, however, for concluding that they were. Of the 4 regiments in which Howe served before becoming a general officer, 3 had field lodges, and as colonel he would have had to condone, if not preside over, their activities. As we have seen, moreover, Howe served under Amherst and Wolfe in an army where Freemasonry was rampant. During the American War for Independence, his statements and attitudes concur precisely with those of known Freemasons, and of the 31 line regiments under his command in North America, 29 possessed field lodges. Even if Howe himself was not a Freemason, he could not but have absorbed something of Freemasonry's influence. The same applies to Cornwallis, who enjoyed a particularly close rapport with Howe. Cornwallis served in 2 regiments before becoming a general officer and was colonel of one of them. Both had field lodges. As we have seen, Cornwallis's uncle, Edward, subsequently a lieutenant general, had become governor of Nova Scotia and in 1750 founded a lodge there. And indeed, the whole Cornwallis family during the 18th and 19th centuries was one of the most prominent in English Freemasonry. In Clinton's case, the evidence is rather more ambiguous. Prior to becoming a general officer, he did not serve in line regiments, but in the Guards, who did not have field lodges until later. On the other hand, he was aide-de-camp during the 7 Years' War to Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, one of the most active and influential Freemasons of the age. Ferdinand had been inducted in Berlin in 1740. In 1770, he became provincial Grand Master and under the auspices of the English Grand Lodge for the Duchy of Brunswick. A year later, he joined the strict observance. In 1776, he co-founded a prestigious lodge in Hamburg, along with Prince Karl of Hesse. Hesse? Is it Hamburg? Okay, so yeah, sorry. In 1782, he instigated the Convent of Wilhelmsbad, a major congress for the whole of European Freemasonry. As Ferdinand's aide-de-camp, Clinton would unquestionably have been exposed to Freemasonry and its ideals. Moreover, a record survives of a St. John's Day festival celebrated by the Master and Brethren of Lodge No. 210 on 25 June 1781, while the British Army was in occupation of New York. According to this record, toasts were drunk. Quote, "To the King and the Craft, to Queen with Masons' wives, Sir Henry Clinton and all Royal Masons, Admiral Arbuthnot and all distressed Masons, Generals Nifison and Riedesel, and visiting brethren, Lords Cornwallis and Rawdon, with ancient fraternity." End quote. Kind of rough to read. Thus Freemasonry pervaded both the British Army and the rebellious colonies. It must be stressed at this point, however, that the evidence which follows does not attest to any kind of coherent, organized Freemasonic conspiracy. Most historians of the American War for Independence have tended, so far as Freemasonry is concerned, to fall into one of 2 camps. Certain fringe writers, for example, have sought to portray the war exclusively as a Freemasonic event, a movement engineered, orchestrated, and conducted by cabals of Freemasons in accordance with some carefully calculated grand design. Such writers will often cite lengthy lists of Freemasons, which proves little more than that they have lengthy lists of Freemasons to cite. And there is certainly no shortage of such lists. On the other hand, most conventional historians circumvent the Freemasonic aspect of the conflict entirely. Philosophers such as Hume, Locke, Adam Smith, and the French philosophies are regularly enough invoked, but the Freemasonic milieu, which paved the way for such thinkers, which act as a kind of amniotic fluid for their ideas and which imparted to those ideas their popular currency, is neglected. In fact, there was no Freemasonic conspiracy. Of the 56 signatories of the Declaration of Independence, only 9 can definitely be identified as Freemasons, while 10 others may possibly have been. Of the general officers in the Continental Army, there were, as far as documentation can establish, 33 Freemasons out of 74. Granted, the known Freemasons were, as a rule, more prominent, more instrumental in shaping the course of events than their unaffiliated colleagues, but not even they were working in any kind of concert toward any kind of prearranged grand design. It would have been impossible for them to do so. The movement which culminated in American independence was, in effect, an ongoing and constant exercise in improvisation and in what today would be called a kind of ad hoc damage control. Unexpected faits accomplis had to be confronted, accepted, contained, and turned to account one step at a time until the next fait accompli dictated a new sequence of impromptu adaptations and adjustments. In this process, Freemasonry tended, as the whole, to act as a restraining and moderating influence. In 1775, for example, a number of militant radicals were already agitating for a complete sever of ties with Britain. As a Freemason, however, General Joseph Warren, subsequent commander of colonial troops at Bunker Hill, was issuing statements that anticipate those of Ulster's Unionists today, that he was defying Parliament, but remained loyal to the Crown. Washington held precisely the same position, and even as late as December 1777, a year after the Declaration of Independence, Franklin was prepared to renounce all thoughts of independence if the grievances which had precipitated the war were redressed. It is thus as foolish to speak of Freemasonic conspiracies as it is to discount Freemasonry altogether. Ultimately, the currents of thought disseminated by Freemasonry were to prove more crucial and more pervasive than Freemasonry itself. The republic which emerged from the war was not in any literal sense a Freemasonic republic, was not, that is, a republic created by Freemasons for Freemasons, in accordance with Freemasonic ideals, but it did embody those ideals. It was profoundly influenced by those ideals, and it owed much more to those ideals than is generally recognized or acknowledged. As one Masonic historian has written, quote, Freemasonry has exercised a greater influence upon the establishment and development of the American government, than any other single institution. Neither general historians nor the members of the fraternity, since the dates of the first constitutional conventions, have realized how much the United States of America owes to Freemasonry, and how great a part it played in the birth of the nation and the establishment of the landmarks of that civilization. End quote, and end chapter. So, that takes us to Chapter 17, which is, what do we got? 8 pages. So, Chapter 17, the resistance to Britain. As we have seen, the orthodox or official form of English Freemasonry, as exemplified by Grand Lodge, offered at most only the first 3 craft degrees. The so-called higher degrees, as far as can be determined, were initially unique to the older Jacobite Freemasonry. Following the 1745 rebellion, higher degree Freemasonry did not die out. It simply lost its I couldn't read the word for a second. I don't know why. It simply lost its specifically Jacobite, specifically political orientation and continued to function. Purged of its Stuart affiliations, it was no longer perceived as subversive by Grand Lodge, who began, albeit grudgingly, to accord official recognition to the higher degrees. It soon became increasingly respectable for loyal, upstanding, and civic-minded Englishmen through specialized study to work for such higher degrees as the Mark degree, the Royal Arch, or Royal Ark Mariner. They did not they did so under a variety of auspices, including Grand Lodge of Ireland and Grand Lodge of Scotland, and the strict observance created by Baron von Hund. As we have seen, it was Hund who, for the first time, as far as public record is concerned, claimed for Freemasonry a Templar ancestry. Prior to the 7 Years' or French Indian War, most of the Freemasonry in North America was Orthodox pro-Hanoverian, warranted by Grand Lodge. During the 7 Years' War, however, high-degree Freemasonry, by means of regimental field lodges, was transplanted on a large scale to the American colonies and quickly took root. Boston, the soil from which the American Revolution was to spring, exemplifies the process of transplantation and the friction that sometimes arose from it. St. Andrew's Lodge of Boston. Freemasonry had begun in Massachusetts in 1733 when Henry Price, acting as authority from the Grand Lodge of England, became Grand Master of Massachusetts. Massachusetts' own provincial Grand Lodge, St. John's. His deputy Grand Master, as we have seen, was Andrew Belcher, son of the provincial governor. Wow. In 1750, there were 2 other lodges based in Boston. Both they and their parent lodge, St. John's, met at a tavern called the Bunch of Grapes, at the junction of what today are State and Kilby Streets, and British regiments with warrants from Grand Lodge also met on the premises. Subsequently, St. John's was to warrant more than 40 lodges under its umbrella. Meanwhile, in 1743, Grand Lodge of England had named a distinguished Boston merchant, one Thomas Oxnard, Provincial Grand Master of North America. Boston thus became, in effect, the Freemasonic capital of Britain's transatlantic colonies. But in 1752, an irregular lodge, without an official warrant, was found to be operating at another tavern, the Green Dragon, renamed Freemasons' Hall in 1764. When the scandalized members of St. John's complained, the irregular lodge duly applied for a warrant of its own, not from the Grand Lodge of England, however, but from the Grand Lodge of Scotland, which offered higher degrees. The warrant was not forthcoming until 1756. When British troops and their regimental field lodges, chartered by both Irish and Scottish Grand Lodge, began to arrive in America. The irregular lodge was then warranted under the name of St. Andrew's. Soon, however, it began to warrant lodges of its own, and claimed for itself, therefore, the status of a provincial Grand Lodge, under the authority of Grand Lodge of Scotland. There were thus 2 rival provincial Grand Lodges in Boston, St. John's under the aegis of Grand Lodge of England, and St. Andrew's under the aegis of Grand Lodge of Scotland. Not surprisingly, things became acrimonious, tempers flared, a them and us situation developed, and a miniaturized civil war of Freemasonic insult ensued. St. John's looked askance at St. Andrew's, and with vindictive passion repeatedly passed resolutions against it. Whatever they entailed, these resolutions produced no effect, and St. John's proceeded to sulk, petulantly forbidding its members to visit St. Andrew's. In squabbles of this sort, some of Boston's most eminent citizens expended considerable time, energy, and passion. Ignoring the strictures against it, St. Andrews continued to meet and to gain recruits, sometimes indeed pilfering them from St. John's, and on 28 August 1769 St. Andrews conferred for the first time anywhere in the world a new Freemasonic degree, specifically called the Knights Templar degree. Where precisely this degree came from is unclear. Although no definitive documentation exists, it is believed to have been brought to Boston by the 29th Foot, later the 1st Battalion of the Worcestershire Regiment. Sorry, had a intrusive thought. Whose field lodge had been warranted by the Grand Lodge of Ireland 10 years before. In any case, the Templar pedigree arrogated by the Jacobites and promulgated by Hund was now beginning to gain adherents beyond their particular rites. From Boston, the Freemasonic degree of Knight Templar was to be carried back to England and Scotland. But the bestowal of the first known Knight Templar degree was not to be St. Andrew's sole claim to distinction. By 1773 it had assumed a position in the vanguard of what were now rapidly escalating events. At that time its Grand Master was Joseph Warren, whom Grand Lodge of Scotland had appointed Grand Master for the whole of North America. Among the other members of the lodge were John Hancock and Paul Revere. For some 8 years prior to 1773, friction between Britain and her American colonies had been assuming increasingly ominous proportions. Virtually bankrupted by the 7 Years' War, Britain had sought to replenish her treasury at the colonies' expense by imposing a series of ever more stringent tax measures. Each such measure had naturally provoked new resistance and angry opposition in the colonies. In 1769, the Virginia Assembly, prompted by Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, both alleged Freemasons, had formally condemned the British government and been dissolved by the provincial governor. In 1770, the famous Boston Massacre had occurred, when a British sentry and his colleagues, surrounded by a hostile crowd, fired a volley into it and killed 5 people. In 1771, an uprising in North Carolina had to be quelled by troops, and 13 rebels were executed for treason. In 1772, 2 prominent Freemasons, John Brown and Abraham Whipple, had attacked a customs ship off Rhode Island and burned it. The situation came to a head when the Tea Act, passed to save the East India Company from bankruptcy. By virtue of this act, the East India Company was authorized to unload much of its huge tea surplus in the colonies duty-free. This enabled it to undersell both legitimate tea merchants and colonial smugglers, and thus to monopolize the tea trade. In effect, the colonists were coerced into buying only the East India Company's tea, and more of it than they wanted or needed. On 27 November 1773, the first of 3 East India Company merchant ships, the Dartmouth, arrived in Boston with an immense cargo of tea. On 29 and 30 November, mass meetings were held in protest, and the Dartmouth was unable to unload. For more than a fortnight, she remained stranded in port. Then, on the night of 16 December, a group of colonists, variously estimated at between 60 and 200, clumsily and provocatively disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, boarded the ship, and dumped its entire crew, 342 chests of tea, worth some £10,000, into Boston Harbor. This was the famous Boston Tea Party. It was more of a mischievous prank than an act of revolution. In itself, it neither involved nor precipitated violence. There was not to be any shooting in earnest for another 14 months. All the same, the Tea Party effectively marks the beginning of the American War for Independence. At the time of the Tea Party, St. Andrew's Lodge was meeting regularly in what was called the Long Room of Freemasons' Hall, formerly the Green Dragon Tavern. The lodge shared this room with much of its membership and much of its membership, with a burgeoning number of politically oriented secret societies and quasi-Masonic clandestine fraternities dedicated to opposing British fiscal legislation. Among the Among the organizations that met in the Long Room were the Long Room Club, which included St. Andrew's Grand Master Joseph Warren, the Committee of Correspondence, which included Warren and Paul Revere, and synchronized local opposition with opposition in other American cities such as Philadelphia and New York, and the North End Caucus, which included a good many Freemasonic brethren, including Warren. Another, even more militant organization was the Sons of Liberty, and its inner nucleus, the so-called Loyal Nine, who advocated violence and had been fomenting riots, demonstrations, and other forms of civil disobedience since 1765. Prominent among the Sons of Liberty was Samuel Adams, who is not known to have been a Freemason. Neither did the Sons of Liberty meet at the Long Room of Freemasons' Hall. Again, however, its membership overlapped that of St. Andrew's Lodge. Paul Revere, for example, was particularly active in the Sons of Liberty. At least 3 of the Loyal Nine were also Freemasonic brethren of St. Andrew's. The record of meetings of St. Andrew's Lodge immediately prior to the Boston Tea Party is revealing. On 30 November 1773, for example, the second day of mass protest at the Dartmouth's arrival, the lodge met, but only 7 members were present. According to the minute book, it was motioned and seconded that the lodge be adjourned to Thursday evening next, on account of the few brethren present. N.B. consignees of the tea took up the brethren's time. On the Thursday stipulated, 2 December 15 members of the and 1 visitor attended the lodge, and officers for the following year were elected. A week later, on 9 December, the date scheduled for the regular monthly meeting, 14 members and 10 visitors were present. But official business was postponed until the following week, the 16th. That night was the night of the Boston Tea Party. Only 5 members attended the lodge. Beneath their names in the minute book, it is stated, "Lodge closed on account of the few members present until tomorrow evening." Contrary to some subsequent claims and legends, the Tea Party does not appear to have been planned at St. Andrew's Lodge. In fact, it appears to have been planned by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, but there is no question that at least 12 members of the lodge were involved in the party. Not only that, 12 other participants afterwards became members of St. Andrew's. The Tea Party, moreover, could not have occurred without the active collusion of 2 detachments of colonial militia who were supposed to be guarding the Dartmouth's cargo. Of these men, the captain of the first detachment, Edward Proctor, had been a member of St. Andrew's Lodge since 1763. 3 of his men, Stephen Bruce, Thomas Knox, and Paul Revere, were also members of the lodge, and 3 others were members of the Loyal Nine. In the second detachment of militia, 3 more men were members of St. Andrew's. Altogether, 19 members out of the 48 in the 2 militia attachments are known to have collaborated in dumping the Dartmouth's tea. Of these 19, 6, including the detachment commander, were members of the St. Andrew's, and 3 more were members of the Loyal Nine. The Continental Army. The day after the Tea Party, Paul Revere rode to New York, where news of what had happened was published and gleefully circulated among the other colonies. When the news reached London 3 months later, the reaction was swift and misguidedly drastic. A law was passed, the Boston Port Bill, which placed an embargo on all trade with Boston, and the port was effectively closed. The city, and by extension the whole of Massachusetts, was lifted out of the hands of civil administration and placed under what amounted to martial law. A military man, General Thomas Gage, was appointed governor of Massachusetts. A year later, in 1775, Gage received substantial reinforcements of British regulars under the command of Sir William Howe. The slowness of transatlantic communication was still impeding the development of events, but they had already begun to assume a momentum of their own. On 5 September 1774, the First Continental Congress was convened in Philadelphia under the presidency of Peyton Randolph, a prominent attorney and provincial Grand Master of Virginia. The Boston delegates, including Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere Samuel Adams of the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere, but contrary to later tradition, there was no unanimity of views or objectives. Few of the representatives at this point desired or even contemplated independence from Britain. Such measures as the Congress passed were essentially economic, not political. They were also highly provisional, a combination of stopgap and bluff. Thus, for example, the Continental Association was formed, nominally to end or curb all trade with Britain and the rest of the world, to seal off the colonial economy and render it entirely self-sufficient. Such a design was hardly feasible in practice, but the enunciation of it could justifiably be expected to galvanize Parliament. Parliament, however, 3,500 miles away, and with little understanding of or interest in the realities of the situation, invariably responded, when galvanized, in the wrong way, with the wrong measures. The situation continued to deteriorate, and when the Massachusetts Provincial Congress met in February 1775, it announced plans for armed resistance. Parliament responded by declaring Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. Amidst the increasingly inflammatory rhetoric that followed, Patrick Henry, in a speech to Virginia's Provincial Assembly, made his famous statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." But the crisis was already passing beyond the domain of rhetoric and even of civic or economic action. On 18 April 1775, 700 British troops were dispatched to seize a depot of militia arms stored at Concord outside Boston. Paul Revere embarked on his famous ride to warn of their advance, and they were confronted at Lexington by 77 armed colonists. A skirmish ensued, the shot heard around the world, and 8 colonists were killed, 10 wounded. En route back to Boston with the confiscated cache of weapons, the British column was harassed by an estimated 4,000 colonial marksmen and sustained 273 casualties, killed and wounded. The colonists lost 90. On 22 April, the Third Provincial Congress of Massachusetts convened, with Joseph Warren, Grand Lodge of Scotland's Grand Master for North America, as president. Warren authorized the mobilization of 30,000 men. At the same time, he wrote in his address to Great Britain, he wrote in his address to Great Britain, quote, "Hostilities are at length commenced in this colony by the troops under the command of General Gage. These brethren are marks of ministerial vengeance against this colony for refusing, with her sister colonies, a submission to slavery, but they have not yet detached us from our royal sovereign. We profess to be his loyal and dutiful subjects. Nevertheless, to the persecution and tyranny of his cruel ministry we will not tamely submit." End quote. Most of the non-Freemasons among the defiant colonists, men such as John and Samuel Adams, were already demanding more radical measures. As we have noted, however, Warren, in declaring his continued allegiance to the Crown, if not to Parliament, expressed the position of most Freemasons, and it was this position that prevailed when, on 10 May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened. first under the presidency of Peyton Randolph, then, when he died, under John Hancock of St. Andrew's Lodge, and authorized the raising of a full-fledged army. George Washington, a prominent Freemason under the Virginia Grand Mastership of Randolph, was appointed commander-in-chief. At least one historian has suggested that he owed his appointment to his Freemasonic connections. Certainly there were more experienced military men available, although virtually all of them were Freemasons too. Indeed, during the early days of the war, the high command of the Continental Army was dominated by Freemasons. It is worth digressing to consider, albeit briefly, some of their biographies. Among those who might well have been appointed supreme commander in Washington's stead was General Richard Montgomery. Montgomery had been born in Ireland, near Dublin. During the French and Indian War, he served as a regular officer in the British Army under Amherst. At the siege of Louisbourg, he was in the 17th Foot, subsequently the Leicestershire Regiment, which formed part of Wolfe's brigade. Settling in the colonies after the war, Montgomery married the daughter of Robert R. Livingston, who in 1784 was to become Grand Master of New York's Provincial Grand Lodge, and who in 1789 administered the oath whereby Washington became first President of the United States. Montgomery is believed to have been inducted into the Field Lodge of the 17th Foot during the Louisbourg campaign. Certainly his status as a Freemason was well known among his contemporaries. Warren, Montgomery, and Wooster was a frequent Freemasonic toast, commemorating three distinguished brethren who were among the first to die in the conflict. General David Wooster had been a colonel when then a brigadier during the French and Indian War. He served under Amherst at Louisbourg and is believed to have joined a field lodge there with Lord Blaney, subsequently Grand Master of English Grand Lodge. As early as 1750, Wooster had organized the Hiram Lodge No. 1 in New Haven and became its first master. General Hugh Mercer had served as a surgeon's mate in the rebel Jacobite army of Charles Edward Stuart. After Culloden, he escaped to Philadelphia, where 10 years later he served under Braddock and was wounded at Fort Duchesne. A year later he was in the strongly Freemasonic 60th Foot. When Fort Duchesne was rebuilt as Fort Pitt, Mercer was placed in command of it with the rank of colonel. A long-standing Freemason, he was in the same Fredericksburg Lodge as Washington. General Arthur St. Clair had been born in Caithness and was descended from Sir William St. Clair, the builder of Roslyn Chapel. Like Montgomery, St. Clair joined the British Army, served in the 60th Foot during 1756 and 7, then with Wolfe's brigade under Amherst at Louisbourg. A year later, he was with Wolfe at Quebec, whatever. In 1762, he resigned his commission and settled in the colonies. He is known to have been a Freemason, though no details of his induction or lodge affiliation have survived. General Horatio Gates had also served as a regular officer in the British Army. He too had fought under Amherst at Louisbourg. He was one of Washington's closest personal friends and married the daughter of the Provincial Grand Master for Nova Scotia. His precise Freemasonic affiliations are uncertain, but he is known to have been an habitue of Provincial Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. General Israel Putnam had served under Lord George Howe and was with him at his death in the disastrous frontal assault on Fort Ticonderoga. Subsequently, Putnam served under Amherst. He had been a Freemason since 1758, when he joined a field lodge at Crown Point shortly after Amherst's capture of the fort. General John Stark had seen action along with Lord George Howe in the irregular guerrilla unit known as Rogers Rangers. Subsequently, he was with Howe at Ticonderoga, then with Amherst. He may have become a Freemason at that time, but no conclusive evidence of his affiliation exists prior to 1778. This is a sampling of what amounts in effect to something like a litany. The list could easily be prolonged. General John Nixon was with Lord George Howe at Ticonderoga, then with Amherst at Louisbourg, as was General Joseph Fry. General William Maxwell was with George Howe at Ticonderoga, then with Wolfe at Quebec, as was General Elias Dayton. All were Freemasons. One man who deeply resented Washington's appointment, so much so that it eventually led him to treason, was Benedict Arnold. Arnold, too, had served under Amherst and is believed to have become a Freemason at that time. In 1765, he joined David Wooster's Hiram Lodge No. 1 in New Haven. Arnold's friend, Colonel Ethan Allen, had served with George Howe at Ticonderoga, then with Amherst. In July 1777, he received the first or entered apprentice degree from a lodge in Vermont, but seems not to have advanced any further. And that is the end of that chapter. That leads us into chapters 18 and 19, which we will finish up on Tuesday, along with a little bit of other stuff. There's like an interlude that's a couple pages. I don't know what that's about. Then it goes into chapter 19 with a bunch of pictures. And then there's a postscript of a couple of pages. So it will be a fairly long session to get through all of that, but we'll finish up this book Tuesday. And I will see you all tomorrow night for Star Wars and some gaming, probably. Just depends on how the day goes. But I will see you then. Have a good night.